On the night of September 11th, 1899, a 23-year-old student named Alice Knott sat in her bedroom in a Washington, D.C. boarding house. She was doing exactly what she did every single night, which was to study. Alice was a young woman who rarely left her room, preferring the quiet comfort of her own space over the bustling streets of the city. She had spent the last few months preparing to take a highly important civil service exam. She absolutely had to pass this exam if she wanted to land the stable, secure government job that she desperately wanted and needed to support herself. Her future depended entirely on her performance on this test, so she poured all of her energy into her textbooks. But studying was not the only reason that Alice seemingly never went out. Alice was also naturally a recluse, a trait that had grown stronger over the years. This was in part because she suffered from a variety of severe health issues, including a weak heart and poor circulation, and she just generally got sick very easily. For Alice, being out in the world was incredibly tiring, and it was also quite scary because she never knew when her health might take a turn for the worse. It was just much easier and safer for her to stay inside where she could control her environment and avoid any unnecessary risks. As the night went on, it started getting quite late, and the room began to grow chilly. Alice noticed some very cold air coming in through her open bedroom window. It was actually unusually cold outside for that time of year, and the wind was starting to pick up. Since she got sick so easily, she did not want to risk this cold draft giving her an illness or making her weak heart act up. So, she decided to set her study materials down on her desk for a moment, and she walked over to close the heavy wooden window. On her way back to her desk, she looked up and smiled at the other very important reason that she spent so much time alone in her room. This was her beloved pet parrot, whose name was Polly. Polly was sitting on his typical perch, which was actually one of the room's metal light fixtures. As he saw Alice approaching, he got really excited and began squawking very loudly, flapping his colorful wings. Now, Alice knew that basically any minute now, she was very likely going to hear a loud, angry knock at her door from one of the other residents. The other people who lived in this boarding house absolutely hated Polly. To be fair, Polly was admittedly a very mean and difficult bird. He was not just loud, but he also bit people and made threatening noises at the other residents whenever they passed by her door. He had some very bad, disruptive habits that drove pretty much everyone in the building completely crazy. For example, right now, Polly was not only squawking at the top of his lungs, but he was also pecking aggressively at the metal frame of the light fixture he was sitting on. This made an incredibly annoying metal-on-metal noise, and it was also damaging the fixture itself. The other tenants did not care too much about the property damage, but the landlord certainly did. There was a general consensus in the boarding house that Polly was a nasty, destructive nuisance, and they had repeatedly told Alice that she needed to get rid of the bird immediately or find a new place to live. But Alice simply refused to get rid of Polly. She loved Polly with all her heart, and Polly loved Alice back. He was never mean to Alice. He followed her around her room and was always very sweet and affectionate with her, often resting on her shoulder while she studied. Alice felt an incredibly deep attachment to this bird. In many ways, she viewed Polly as her only family. The only reason she was living in this boarding house to begin with was because her brother and both of her parents had passed away a few years prior, leaving her completely alone in the world. She had no close friends and no other relatives to turn to. Most of her days and nights were spent with just her and Polly in this small room. It was the most important relationship in her life, and she could not bear the thought of giving him up. So Alice walked over to the light fixture, looked up at Polly, and gently told him to stop pecking and quiet down. Amazingly, the bird listened immediately, proving how strong their bond was. He went completely quiet. Alice petted him on his head for a second, and then she went back to her desk to resume studying. For the next few hours, she focused entirely on her books until her eyes grew far too heavy to stay open, and she finally decided to crawl into bed and go to sleep. Several hours later, in the absolute dead of night, Alice suddenly stirred awake. She sat up in her bed, her heart pounding against her ribs. She had no idea what had caused her to wake up so abruptly. The room was completely dark and silent, save for the faint sound of the wind outside. But as she sat there in the dark, she realized that something felt terribly wrong. Her chest felt incredibly tight, like a heavy weight was pressing down on her lungs, making it almost impossible to draw a full breath. She was also starting to feel extremely dizzy, and her head was spinning. She realized she was in serious trouble and needed help. She slowly got out of bed, her legs shaking violently, and began to stumble her way across the dark room toward the hallway door. But she did not make it. After taking only a few tentative steps, her legs completely gave out from under her, and she collapsed heavily onto the wooden floor, slipping into unconsciousness. The next day, just before 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the landlord of the boarding house was bustling around the kitchen, putting some lunch on the dining table. The landlord took great pride in providing nice meals for the guests, and today was no exception. Once all the food was laid out, the landlord called out to the house, letting everyone know that lunch was ready and they should come down to eat. Within a few moments, almost all of the tenants appeared at the table, talking and laughing as they began serving themselves. but the landlord immediately noticed that someone was missing. Alice was not there. This bothered the landlord because nobody had seen Alice all morning. They knew Alice typically stayed up very late into the night studying, so it was not entirely unusual for her to sleep in. But even by her relaxed standards, 1 o'clock in the afternoon was exceptionally late. The landlord began to feel a growing sense of worry. What if her poor health had acted up again? The landlord decided to walk up to her room on the top floor to check on her and make sure she was okay. The landlord walked down the long, quiet hallway to the very last door, which belonged to Alice. The landlord knocked firmly on the door but received no response. After knocking a few more times and calling out her name with still no answer, the landlord decided to reach down and turn the brass doorknob. To their surprise, the door was unlocked. The landlord slowly pushed the door open, intending to peek inside, but immediately, as soon as that door cracked open, the landlord began to violently gag and choke. It turns out there were a lot of things about Polly that had concerned the other residents, but Alice had always looked the other way because of her loneliness. However, there was one major safety hazard that Alice should never have ignored, and that was her parrot's highly unusual addiction. Back in 1899, interior lighting inside of homes was almost exclusively powered by gas, which was delivered through metal pipes and burned with an open flame. As it turned out, Polly had developed a habit of inhaling that gas. He would literally get high by pecking at the metal valve on the light fixture. He was not pecking at the fixture just to make noise or to damage the property. He had figured out how to turn the valve open with his beak so he could suck on the escaping gas until he eventually passed out. Alice actually knew that Polly did this. On normal days, she would stop him when she caught him pecking, or if he had already turned the valve and passed out, she would simply move him to safety and close the valve. She had also always kept her bedroom window cracked open to ensure that any leaking gas would vent outside and not build up in the room, but on this particular night, because it was so unusually cold, Alice had closed the window completely. She was so exhausted from her intense studying that she fell into an extremely deep sleep. After she fell asleep, Polly climbed up to his perch, pecked the gas valve open, inhaled the gas, and passed out. But because the window was tightly shut, the poisonous gas did not escape. It continued to pour out of the open valve, slowly filling the small room over the course of several hours. When the landlord opened the door that afternoon, they were hit by a massive, concentrated wave of toxic coal gas that had been trapped inside the room for over 12 hours. As the landlord gasped for fresh air and coughed violently, they looked into the room and saw Alice's lifeless body lying on the floor next to the bed. She had died from inhaling the toxic fumes in her sleep. But then, looking down right at their feet, the landlord saw Polly. The parrot was flattened against the floor, with his beak wedged tightly into the tiny crack at the bottom of the door. The parrot had actually survived. When the room began filling with gas, the bird had somehow realized there was fresh air coming from the hallway through the bottom of the door. He had dragged himself to the door, stuck his beak under the crack, and breathed the clean air until morning. The parrot made a full recovery, and unfortunately he would continue to try and huff gas whenever he got the chance for the rest of his life. Now, let us fast forward to a late night in September of 1993. Inside her home in the quiet town of Stoneham, Massachusetts, a 43-year-old woman named Linda Gotti suddenly startled awake. She sat up in her bed, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. She had just experienced a truly horrible nightmare, and it was about her own impending death. In a few weeks, Linda and her boyfriend, whose name was Tim Stryker, were planning to go on a relaxing vacation. They had booked a cruise to the beautiful Caribbean, a trip they had been planning for months. But in the dream Linda had just experienced, she was on that very vacation, and she had clearly seen herself dying a violent death inside of a car. This was no ordinary, run-of-the-mill dream. It had been incredibly vivid, highly detailed, and so realistic that even though she was now wide awake in her own quiet bedroom, her heart was racing. She was dripping with sweat, and she felt an intense, overwhelming sense of dread. It felt as though she could not fully shake the terror of the dream. As she sat there in the dark, waiting for her breathing to return to normal, she began to realize something that chilled her to the bone. She did not believe this was just a simple nightmare. She was convinced it was a genuine premonition. To understand why Linda took this dream so seriously, you have to understand who she was. Linda was a highly respected medical doctor. She worked as an obstetrician and gynecologist at a busy local hospital in Stoneham. By all accounts, she was absolutely brilliant at her job. Her patients loved her, and her colleagues respected her deeply. This was not just because she was intelligent and highly trained, but also because she possessed a remarkably strong intuition. She seemed to have a sort of sixth sense when it came to her medical practice. In numerous cases throughout her career, Linda had trusted her gut feelings, predicting medical complications before they actually showed up on any tests or machines. For instance, she had once insisted on performing an emergency procedure on a patient because of a strong feeling, only to discover that the baby's life was indeed in immediate danger. By acting on these strange intuitive feelings, she had literally saved the lives of multiple mothers and their newborn babies. Because of this, she had built a massive reputation throughout the entire region. Patients would travel from hours away just to see her because it felt like she could foresee and handle any medical issue. But this sixth sense of hers was not just limited to her work at the hospital. She had also experienced these powerful gut feelings and premonitions in her personal life. Almost every single time she had one of these strong feelings, they turned out to be completely accurate. Whether it was predicting a friend's sudden news or knowing when to avoid a certain road, her intuition had never let her down. So, as she sat in her bed that night, Linda felt a profound sense of certainty. She knew that if she wanted to protect her own life, she had to cancel the upcoming trip to the Caribbean. Even though she knew deep down that canceling the vacation was the right decision, it was still a massive disappointment. She had spent months planning this trip, and she had been looking forward to some much-needed rest and relaxation away from the stressful hospital environment. Her boyfriend, Tim, was also incredibly excited about it. Beyond just wanting a break from work, Linda had felt that this trip was incredibly important for the survival of her relationship with Tim. They had been together for about 4 years, and because they both worked as doctors at the very same hospital, they spent nearly all of their time together. But lately, things had been very difficult between them. They had been fighting constantly, and Tim had become increasingly overprotective and controlling of her time and her interactions with others. It was becoming physically and emotionally exhausting for Linda to deal with his behavior, and their relationship had started to feel quite toxic. She had viewed this upcoming cruise as a perfect opportunity for them to escape the high-pressure environment of the hospital, get away from their daily routines, and work through their issues in a happy, beautiful setting. But now, all of that was off the table. Linda knew she would have to break the news to Tim that she was canceling the trip, which she knew would make him incredibly angry. She would also have to find some other way for them to reconcile, perhaps by planning a different, smaller getaway or finding a new way to break the toxic patterns they had fallen into. Eventually, the initial shock of the nightmare began to fade, and Linda laid back down on her pillow. She told herself that she would deal with the fallout in the morning. This situation was certainly bad, she thought, but at least she was actively preventing her own death by choosing not to go on the cruise. A few weeks later, on the night of September 30th, Linda was storming down one of the brightly lit hallways of the hospital toward her office. She was absolutely fuming. If things had gone according to their original plan, she and Tim would have been leaving for their Caribbean cruise in just a few days. But because of her terrifying nightmare, Linda had gone ahead and officially canceled the entire trip. As expected, Tim was incredibly angry and annoyed. He had been very vocal about how ridiculous he thought her reasoning was. He repeatedly told her that canceling an expensive vacation because of a bad dream was completely absurd and childish. This situation had made the atmosphere between them incredibly tense, on top of the issues they were already dealing with. Just a few minutes prior, Linda and Tim had run into each other in the hospital hallway. They had ended up getting into a massive, loud argument right there in public, and several of their coworkers had overheard the entire thing. Linda was not only incredibly angry with Tim, but she was also deeply embarrassed that her professional colleagues had witnessed such a personal and toxic fight. As soon as she reached her office, she walked inside, slammed the heavy door shut behind her, and sat down at her desk. She tried to force herself to focus on her work, opening up patient charts and trying to review medical records, but she simply could not concentrate. Her mind was racing. She kept telling herself that canceling the trip was the absolute right thing to do. She remained fully convinced that if they had gone to the Caribbean, she, and perhaps even Tim, would have died in a terrible car accident. She believed she had successfully cheated death by making this hard decision. But at the same time, she hated how much this decision was damaging her relationship and causing her so much daily stress. She took a series of deep breaths, trying to calm herself down. She reminded herself that she had some great things coming up that would help distract her from all this relationship drama. Her day off was tomorrow, and she had booked herself a long, relaxing massage. Even better, her college reunion was happening that upcoming weekend. These were two events she was genuinely excited about, and crucially, she had not had any bad dreams or premonitions about them, so she had no reason to cancel them. By the time 8:15 in the evening arrived, Linda's long shift at the hospital finally came to an end. As she walked out of the building toward her car, she actually found herself in relatively good spirits. Even though she and Tim had certainly not resolved their issues and they were still barely speaking to one another, Linda was determined not to let this relationship drama ruin her life. She wanted to just move forward, enjoy her weekend, and trust that things would eventually sort themselves out. 4 days later, on the afternoon of Monday, October 4th, one of Linda's close personal friends was driving toward the hospital where Linda worked. This friend was feeling extremely worried. She had not heard from Linda since they last spoke on the phone on Thursday evening. Normally, this would not be a huge cause for concern since they did not talk every single day. But earlier that morning, the friend had spoken to one of Linda's coworkers from the hospital. The coworker had mentioned that Linda had completely failed to show up for her scheduled shift that morning. The entire hospital staff was in a state of panic because Linda was someone who absolutely never missed work. In the rare event that she had an emergency, she always called in ahead of time. To find out that she had not shown up, had not called, and that nobody had any idea where she was highly alarming. The hospital had even sent a staff member to Linda's house to do a wellness check, but her car was gone and she was not home. Linda's friend was heading to the hospital to meet up with Linda's colleagues so they could pool their information and try to figure out what had happened. But as the friend turned her car into the hospital's main parking lot, she immediately realized that something was terribly wrong. The entire parking lot was crawling with police cars, their blue and red lights flashing. Officers had completely taped off a large section of the parking area with yellow crime scene tape. A large group of doctors, nurses, and hospital staff were standing near the perimeter of the tape, looking absolutely devastated. The friend quickly parked her car, jumped out, and ran over to the group to see what was happening. When she looked past the police officers toward one of the parked cars, she let out a loud gasp of pure horror. It would turn out that Linda's terrifying premonition had been eerily and tragically accurate. But Linda had completely misinterpreted the details. On that previous Thursday evening, after she had finished her long shift and was looking forward to her massage and her college reunion, Linda had walked out of the hospital to her car. She had been trying hard to put the fight with Tim out of her mind and just focus on having a good weekend. But Linda never actually made it home. In fact, she never even managed to leave the hospital parking lot. Shortly after walking out to her vehicle, Linda was suddenly and brutally attacked. She was strangled to death right there inside of her own car. Linda had been so thoroughly convinced that her dream of dying in a car was tied directly to their trip to the Caribbean, and that by avoiding the trip, she would save her own life. What she had completely failed to realize was that the location of the premonition was not the important part. The premonition was simply warning her that she was going to die inside of a car, and that is exactly what happened. Her intuition had been right, but her interpretation had proved fatal. The police immediately focused their entire investigation on Linda's boyfriend, Tim Stryker. He was the only logical suspect. He had absolutely no alibi for the night Linda went missing, and incredibly, even after Linda's body was discovered, Tim still went ahead and took the Caribbean cruise by himself. The police also discovered that Tim had actively tried to pay a witness a large sum of money to lie to investigators. He wanted the witness to claim they had seen Linda with another unidentified man at the time of her death, in an attempt to divert suspicion away from himself. Despite all of this highly suspicious behavior, prosecutors ultimately determined that they did not have enough direct physical evidence to officially charge Tim Stryker with Linda's murder, and he consistently denied having any involvement in her death. However, he was successfully prosecuted and convicted on federal perjury charges for trying to bribe the witness. He was sentenced to serve 4 years in federal prison, and he would eventually pass away in 2011 without ever being held legally responsible for Linda's actual murder. Now, let us travel much further back in time to a chilly spring evening in the year 1705 in the small town of Lurgan, Ireland. Inside a modest, dimly lit home, a middle-aged man named John McCall sat quietly by his wife's bedside. John was crying so hard that his shoulders were shaking, and he could barely catch his breath. His beloved wife, Marjorie, had just passed away only a few minutes earlier. She had spent the last several days battling a truly horrific, raging fever. John was actually a highly trained local doctor, and when his wife had first fallen ill, he had immediately done everything in his power to treat her. But despite all of his medical knowledge and his desperate efforts, John had been completely unable to diagnose exactly what was causing this violent illness. He had been forced to watch in absolute horror and helplessness as the fever slowly ravaged Marjorie's body, causing her organs to shut down one by one. In some ways, when her breathing finally stopped and her body went still, John felt a tiny sense of relief, knowing that her intense suffering had finally come to an end. But this small mercy did nothing to lessen the devastating pain of his loss. He felt an overwhelming sense of failure and guilt. He was a doctor, a man who spent his life healing others, yet he had been completely powerless to save the most important person in his life. For John, Marjorie was his entire world. They had been together for decades, building a beautiful life in their close-knit community. They had raised children together, and they had recently welcomed several grandchildren into the family. They were only in their 50s, and they had spent almost their entire adult lives by each other's side. John felt completely lost, like a ship that had been cast adrift in a violent storm. He looked down at Marjorie's pale face, and then he slowly reached out and took her hand. It was a hand he had held thousands of times before, a hand whose shape and texture were as familiar to him as his own. He squeezed her fingers gently, but they were completely limp and cold. The stark reality of her death hit him all over again, and he began to sob uncontrollably. As he held her hand, his eyes drifted to her fingers, and he noticed the beautiful gold wedding ring resting on her ring finger. John remembered how hard he had worked as a young man to save up enough money to buy that specific ring, and how much Marjorie had treasured it throughout their marriage. Seeing that gold band on her lifeless hand seemed to symbolize the absolute finality of this moment. Their long journey together was officially over. But as John sat there grieving, he knew he could not simply sit in his sorrow forever. He had to start making immediate arrangements for Marjorie's funeral. In 18th century Ireland, it was the standard custom to hold a traditional wake that lasted for several days after a person's death. This allowed friends, neighbors, and extended family members from other towns enough time to travel to the home, pay their respects, and support the grieving family before the actual burial took place. But there was a major catch. If a person had died from a highly contagious or unknown disease, which was clearly the case with Marjorie's sudden and violent fever, the traditional wake was strictly forbidden. In order to prevent the potentially deadly illness from spreading to the rest of the town, the deceased person had to be buried almost immediately, often within less than 24 hours of their passing. John knew this law very well, both as a citizen and as a medical doctor. He knew that Marjorie would have to be placed in the ground by the very next afternoon. The thought of burying his wife so quickly, without a proper send-off, was deeply painful, but he knew he had no choice. The following afternoon, a small group of mourners gathered at the local cemetery in Lurgan. John stood silently next to his wife's simple wooden casket as it was slowly lowered into the damp earth. Normally, John would have spent this time focused entirely on his grief, recalling all of the wonderful memories he had shared with Marjorie. But on this day, he found himself feeling highly distracted and deeply anxious about one specific detail. He could not stop thinking about Marjorie's gold wedding ring. John had desperately wanted to remove the ring from Marjorie's finger before she was buried. He wanted to keep it as a precious heirloom, something he could pass down to their children and grandchildren, and a physical reminder of the woman he had loved so deeply. But immediately after Marjorie had passed away, her body had begun the natural process of decomposition, and her fingers had started to swell very rapidly. By the time John tried to slip the ring off her finger, her joints were so swollen that the gold band was completely stuck. John had tried using soap and water, and several other family members had tried as well, but the ring would not budge. Ultimately, they had no choice but to leave the ring on her finger and bury her with it. As John watched the gravediggers begin to shovel dirt over the casket, a sense of deep dread began to wash over him. He knew that burying his wife with a highly valuable gold ring was incredibly dangerous. During the early 1700s, Ireland was experiencing widespread famine, extreme poverty, and severe economic hardship. Because so many people were starving and desperate to survive, a highly active and dangerous black market had emerged for stolen goods, and this had led to a massive rise in grave robbing. Desperate criminals, known as resurrectionists, would routinely sneak into local cemeteries under the cover of darkness, dig up recently buried bodies, and strip them of any jewelry, gold teeth, or valuable clothing. Sometimes they would even steal the bodies themselves to sell to medical schools for anatomical dissection. Johns was terrified that Marjorie's grave would become an immediate target for these ruthless criminals. He worried that he would never be able to visit her final resting place without wondering if her body had been disturbed and desecrated. But there was nothing he could do. The burial was completed, the earth was patted down, and the mourners slowly began to disperse. John walked back to his empty home, feeling a profound sense of emptiness. That evening, John's house was filled with his children, grandchildren, and close relatives. They had all gathered together to support John and to hold an informal memorial for Marjorie. They sat around the warm fireplace, sharing their favorite stories about her, laughing through their tears, and raising their glasses to toast to her memory. For John, this gathering was incredibly comforting and therapeutic. It felt good to hear his family speak so highly of the woman who had been his partner for so many years. But as the night wore on, the emotional toll of the past few days began to catch up with John. He was completely exhausted, both physically and mentally. During a brief lull in the conversation, John stood up from his chair, intending to excuse himself and head upstairs to get some sleep. But just as he took his first step toward the stairs, a sudden sharp knock echoed from the front door. The room went quiet. John sighed, assuming that it was probably a well-meaning neighbor who had just heard the news and wanted to offer their condolences. He walked over to the front door, turned the key in the lock, and pulled the heavy wooden door open. But when he looked out into the darkness, he did not see a neighbor. What he saw was so utterly impossible and terrifying that his breath was instantly trapped in his throat. He felt a sudden, agonizing pain shoot through his chest like a tight band squeezing his heart. His vision began to blur, his legs completely buckled underneath him, and he collapsed heavily onto the floor, dead. It turns out John's fears about grave robbers had been entirely justified. Almost immediately after Marjorie's burial, word had spread among the local criminal underworld that a wealthy doctor's wife had been buried wearing a highly valuable solid gold wedding ring. That very night, a pair of local grave robbers had crept into the cemetery armed with shovels. They quickly dug up the fresh earth, pried open the wooden casket, and reached in to grab Marjorie's hand. Just like John, the grave robbers tried to pull the gold ring off her finger, but the intense swelling made it completely impossible to slide off. Because they were desperate and did not want to leave empty-handed, one of the grave robbers pulled out a sharp knife and began to violently slice through Marjorie's swollen finger to cut it off, but as the blade bit deep into her flesh, something completely miraculous and terrifying happened. The sudden, intense physical pain of the cut did something that no doctor had been able to do. It jolted Marjorie out of the deep catatonic state she had been in. As it turned out, Marjorie was not actually dead when she was buried. She had fallen into an extremely rare, deep coma brought on by her mysterious fever, a state that made her breathing and heartbeat so faint that even her doctor husband had been unable to detect them. Because of the rushed burial laws, she had been buried alive. The pain of the knife cut had instantly brought her back to consciousness. Marjorie suddenly sat straight up in her coffin, letting out a blood-curdling scream of pure agony and confusion. The grave robbers were so utterly terrified by the sight of a dead woman screaming and sitting up in her grave that they dropped their shovels and fled into the night, never to return. Marjorie, bleeding heavily from her hand and confused about why she was in a cemetery, managed to climb out of the open grave. She wrapped her bleeding hand in her burial shroud and began the long, cold walk back to her home. When she finally reached her house, she knocked on the door, hoping her husband would help her. But when John opened the door and saw his wife, whom he had literally buried earlier that day, standing on the porch covered in graveyard dirt, bleeding from her hand and wearing her burial shroud, the sheer shock was too much for his weak heart. He suffered a massive heart attack and died instantly. In a strange and tragic twist of fate, John was buried the very next day in the exact same grave plot that Marjorie had just been dug out of. Marjorie went on to recover fully from her illness, and she lived for many more years in the town of Lurgan, though she was always missing her ring finger. When she finally did pass away for real many years later, she was buried in the same cemetery. The local townspeople were so amazed by her incredible story that they gave her a unique headstone with a famous inscription that remains a popular historical attraction to this day. The headstone simply reads, "Lived once, buried twice." That very headstone can still be seen by visitors today at the Shankill Cemetery in Lurgan, Ireland, standing as a permanent monument to one of the most bizarre and unbelievable events in history. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.